Good morning to you, Dr. Hartwich.
Good morning, Michael.
That's right, isn't it? You've been there almost 10 years.
Pretty much to the day. I started on the 1st of May 2012. So yes, that makes it 10 years and a few days.
Now, just before we even get on to what we're going to talk about, which is the housing market and whether or not people can afford houses and things like that, how does a German guy, as educated as you, living in a first world country, decide that he's going to come to New Zealand?
It's a long story.
Had to be a woman.
Yes, but it's an Australian, believe it or not.
Australian woman.
An Australian woman. It's a long story. So basically what happened was I learned English at school in Germany, but only from year 7. My first language I learned was Latin from year 5. And I always felt I needed to learn a bit more than just the school English. So I was looking for pen friends. And after a few attempts of finding a pen friend, I got a surprise letter from Adelaide. And I was registered with an international youth service. They were matchmakers for pen friends. And I got this letter from a Chinese girl in Adelaide asking me whether I'd like to be her pen friend. And then she apologized for 2 pages for being Chinese. And I said, I don't care that you're Chinese. I just want to have a pen friend. So we started writing. We had a pen friendship for 8 years. And then we met on my first visit to Australia. We finished a pen friendship after 5 days. We started long distance afterwards. Then I needed a good excuse to study in Australia, to spend some time with her. And we had 4.5 years of long distance interrupted by times of me visiting her, studying in Australia, her visiting me. Then we lived in London for a while as a compromise, because at the time I didn't need a visa as a German and she could easily get one. We had 4.5 years there. Then we both wanted to have a better quality of life again. She wanted to move to Berlin. I wanted to move to Sydney. So Sydney it was. And then after another 3.5 years in Australia, I suddenly get headhunted for this job in New Zealand. It sounded interesting. I didn't know the country much at the time, but it was exciting. I took the job and we moved to New Zealand, bought a house, had a child, and it's pretty much settled now.
So she's still with you?
She is still with me, yes.
And you met... what a story. Oh, no, what a great love story, actually, to be honest with you. I mean, you meet somebody as a pen friend, and here you are, living in New Zealand now, with the baby, with the child. How old you
he's not a baby, he's 9 now.
9?
It's a boy.
Okay.
It's a boy and he's 9 now, yes.
So he goes to a Wellington school?
He goes to a school in Wellington, yes. He travels on 3 passports, so the lucky boy has Australian, New Zealand and German citizenship. I only have New Zealand citizenship by now and kept my German passport. My wife's is still Australian, so we've got 6 passports in total in the family.
I have to say that one of the things that I enjoyed when I went to Europe was actually going to Germany and discovering that you guys, in actual fact, the Germans speak English better than we did. And so is that a result of, do you have to learn English in Germany, do you? From what age?
Well, at the moment, I think they're even starting earlier than when I went to school. I think it all starts almost in kindergarten, but certainly in primary school. For me, as I said, it only started in year 7, but yes, foreign languages are compulsory and English has to be one of them. So no wonder that you learn relatively decent English. The problem is, of course, you can learn as much as you like. You will never get rid of your accent.
No, yes, well, that's true of New Zealanders as well. All right, now, moving on. You're on the show this morning because we're talking about the housing market in general. And for New Zealanders, we're odd. We're completely different than Germans, for example, on this. I understand that most Germans don't own their own home. Is that correct?
That is correct. The Germans are indeed quite different, at least until a few years ago. That's when things started to change. Once interest rates went down with the Euro crisis, with the GFC, the Germans actually started trying to find a home for their money, and that went into real estate. So the Germans have actually experienced a bit of a real estate boom of sorts as well in the last few years. But traditionally, you're absolutely right, home ownership was not a big thing in Germany simply because it didn't pay to be a homeowner. So I started researching all of this when I worked in London, 2005. And back then I had to look at long-term house price data. And what surprised me at the time was you could have bought a house in Germany for the same price in inflation-adjusted money you would have paid in 1970. So basically for the 35 years from 1970 to 2005, when I looked at the data, there was absolutely no real house price inflation. So house prices basically tracked with a general number of inflation. And Of course, the story in New Zealand, the story in Britain, the story in Ireland or the US, or parts of the US at least, is completely different. That's where housing, of course, always got a bit more expensive over time, to the point that it became totally unaffordable. The German experience is quite different.
Okay, so I guess you would have you obviously looked at New Zealand data. The suggestion is that New Zealanders, a young generation now of New Zealanders, probably the age of my stepchildren in their late 20s, early 30s, won't be able to afford their own house. Is that true or not? What's the affordability issue?
The affordability issue you can look at in two different ways. You can ask yourself whether a house, expensive as it may be, can be afforded given the current level of interest. And I believe we're going to talk about that in a moment. The other way of looking at a house is just to compare it to the general wage level. So you look at a median house and you look at a median household, and then you compare how much does this house cost, how much does the household earn, and then you basically have a multiple. So at the moment in New Zealand, we have multiples around 8 for the whole country. For Auckland, of course, it's even higher, and that means that these houses...
No, wait, Oliver, you're going to have to... I don't know what you say. A multiple of 8 what? 8 times the average wage?
8 times the median household wage is what you would have to pay for a median, so an average house in New Zealand, and 10 times in Auckland. And that is severely unaffordable. The measure for affordability is more like 3 times your household income. That's what your typical house should cost.
Right. Okay. Well, it's not that in New Zealand. We know that. The other factor of this is that building houses here seems disproportionately expensive, which is so many New Zealanders are at Australia now. And one of the first things they report, apart from that the price of cheese is a lot less, is that the price of building a house is so much less. Why is building a house in New Zealand so expensive?
Well, building a house in New Zealand is expensive because our building materials are quite expensive. Plus, we have a cottage industry when it comes to house building. That means there are few big companies actually able to exploit economies of scale, the kind of builders that you would find in Australia, but also in Europe. They are simply not present in New Zealand. However, I think the biggest factor when it comes to housing affordability and to buying and building a house is actually land, because land prices in New Zealand are ridiculously high. I mean, this is a country of a bit more than 5 million people, but geographically it's the size of the UK or Italy. So actually, land prices should never be as high as they are in New Zealand. The reason they are high is because we haven't zoned enough land for development. And so, I mean, it was Milton Friedman, I believe, who once said that a socialist government could create a sand shortage even in the Sahara Desert. This is a bit the situation with New Zealand land and New Zealand land supply. So we've got a country that is actually relatively large compared to population size, and yet we have among the highest land prices in the developed world. So it's ridiculous if you think about it, and that's unfortunately what's driving up our house prices.
Okay, I'd like to test you on that one, because there's a lot of when you talk about giving to private developers land for them to develop, they're simply going to sell it at the market rate, aren't they? So the land prices, no matter how much land you free up around the fringes of cities, are still going to be sold at whatever the market prices that land is sold at.
Sure, but the market price is of course determined by the supply of land. So if you supply more land, then the land price will go down, and then the developers of course will be able to sell you a house at a much cheaper rate than currently. And actually you can see the effects of land zoning in places like Auckland. So we have the rural urban boundary, and for land zoned for development within the boundary, you have to pay a factor, I think, 10 more than outside the boundary. So that shows you actually the differential really created by rationing land supply. And that demonstrates actually that our current land prices are artificially inflated by our planning system.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I buy that. And the reason I'm not so sure I buy that is that I live in central Otago. There's lots of land here. It's not.
But is it zoned for development?
It could. Yeah, you simply apply for a plan change. So what you do is, if you've got rural land, Oliver, you go to the local council and say, I want to rezone this land for the purpose of developing it. And so you get a plan change.
How enthusiastic would the council be to say, yes, let's do that?
I think it depends upon the councils, throughout New Zealand. But in a place like this, I'm only unaware of one plan change that hasn't gone through, and that wasn't because of any aberrant council view. That was simply because it was so close to a motor vehicle, recreational, sort of a Grand Prix track, basically. But the other aspect of this, can I just say to you, and put it another way, would be that if you go into a place, again, if I was thinking of the South Island, but I was thinking of local as well, a number of people, if I went to the Hawke's Bay, there would say, but you're encroaching on arable land. This is prime agricultural land, and that is the most obvious place to build new houses. And so there's that friction as well. Have you struck that?
Yes, of course, I'm aware of that argument. The thing is, of course, even if we take some of our agricultural land for development, we wouldn't starve to death. I mean, you can import potatoes, for example. It's relatively difficult to import houses for people to live in. So I think you have to make a bit of a balanced decision. Apart from that, of course, New Zealand.
So your view, Oliver, would be that you can that in a trade-off between arable land, on which you grow crops and stuff, you'd say the House has the premier position.
Well, I think this is actually something for the market to find out what the best use of land is. So if the market actually determines that actually no, people really need a place to live and therefore housing is a priority and we're willing to pay more for land used for housing, then that is obviously the best choice to make. But can I come back to your point about local government? Because I know that you have a long history yourself in local government. I think local government plays... Oh, okay. Probably more than most in New Zealand. Anyway, what I was going to say. Well,
no. Seriously, I've only served in local government for territorial authority for 6 years when I was a mayor. I'm on the regional council, but that's nothing to do with land, setting land prices or developing.
But in any case, you would understand local government and the pressure it faces. The thing actually about local government and housing, and it brings us back to the discussion we had earlier on Germany. In New Zealand, we have local government set up in a way that it doesn't benefit from development. It doesn't benefit from housing development or actually any other development for that matter, because whenever you generate new development and you generate new taxes out of this new development, like new GST revenue or income taxes, corporate taxes, these taxes end up in Wellington. It's central government getting the tax revenue from development. And local government, conversely, is left with a cost. So we say to local government, can you please fund the infrastructure? Can you please finance all the roads and all the amenities and all the water and all the pipes and everything to make this development happen? And when it happens, or the upside, actually all the tax revenue flows to Wellington. So we've got one tier of government always asked to pay for it, and the other tier is always getting the revenue from it. And guess what? These two tiers of government in New Zealand don't see eye to eye. And when you look at countries like Germany or countries like Switzerland, you see that it can be done differently, where local government actually benefits from development, where whenever something gets built locally, it's the local council that has an uplift in its council revenues. And therefore, they are much more willing to accommodate development, and you have a much more development-friendly population. And therefore, these two countries have actually managed to keep house prices relatively stable for decades.
Yeah, but the difference is that what kind of houses? I mean, the houses that you're talking about go up, they don't go out. So in other words,
in both ways.
Well, yeah, but there's much more intensive housing in the Germanys and the Switzerlands of this world than there is in New Zealand. I mean, the concept of every New Zealander still owning, their backyard and having enough land for a veggie garden or the kid to kick a ball, that's still very strongly present in this country.
I can tell you that Switzerland is not really quite an ugly country either. It is quite scenic. And actually, if you look at Switzerland as an example, actually Switzerland
But I mean, at the same time, let's be very clear here. You've been a strong supporter of removing height restrictions in the city so that people can build up and intensifying land in the cities. where there are already houses, rather than...
Not just. I'm also a supporter of zoning more land for development, because actually we need to have both. We need to have inner cities that are quite densely developed because of agglomeration benefits, and that's what some people want. But we also need to have suburbs, and we need to have cities that are able to grow outwards as well. So it's not a question of up or out. We need both. And actually, if you look at Switzerland, they have found this balance a lot better, I think, than New Zealand. In Switzerland, you have relatively dense but still very beautiful inner cities. You have allowed the cities also to grow out. You have surrounding villages and townships willing to accommodate some of the growth of the bigger cities because they benefit from that. And the result is a Switzerland where the hills are still alive, even though that's Austria. But the thing actually works, and you keep house prices stable. So I think we have to learn a lot from these countries that have managed to keep their housing market stable, provide infrastructure, and keep the local population happy.
The truth of the matter, though, is that nothing's going to stop or start tomorrow, is it? There are no moves from any political party that I'm aware to radically change development or the development land that will be available for development in New Zealand. Are you frustrated with the political process not making the changes required or the changes that you want to see?
Oh, it's always easy to be frustrated by politics, but especially on housing. I think after 10 years of leading the debate on incentives for local government, I think we are seeing some change now. So we have now
under the Labour government.
Not under the Labour government, but you look at National and ACT, both have promised to share GST with councils for precisely the reason I mentioned. So they want to incentivize local government to go for development and compensate them for the infrastructure spending they would have to do if they say yes to development. So in that sense, we have had a bit of a success, and should there be a change of government, I think we will see a completely different style of development and a different approach to it.
The other thing that strikes me now, just, right over the back of where I live, I've got major development occurring, and well, major for us, I guess, not major for Switzerland, but major for us. And those building projects are currently being halted, and the price of those new houses rising on a daily basis because of something that you mentioned at the start of this, the cost of building materials in this country and the lack of supply of them. I think we've only got one gibboard manufacturer in this country that controls over 90% of the market. And
that's a well-known problem. I mean, the Productivity Commission in a report, I think about 8-9 years ago, pointed that out already. There is a relatively easy solution to all of that. I mean, why don't we just allow the importation of building materials from countries that are similar to New Zealand? So we've always heard from government ministries like MB that, our building materials have to be different because New Zealand is different. We've got seismic risks, we've got some geological features in this country that are a bit different from most European ones. Well, but you could import materials, for example, from parts of Canada or from Japan, where they have similar seismic risks, and they would probably work just as well in New Zealand. So why don't we accept the certification of these building materials overseas and allow the import of these materials into New Zealand?
No, listen, that is your strongest point, actually, in my view. I think the monopolies that exist in the building game in this country are also driving up significantly average house prices at the moment. Long term, you might be right. Freeing more land, bringing down the land price. Land prices are exorbitant, extortionate at the moment. But in the short term, we could help new building facility by doing exactly as you suggest. Finally, interest rates. They're going up. They obviously will go up. They'll have to match inflation. And the affordability of mortgages. The banks got pretty, cautious about 2 years ago, Oliver, in terms of their lending policies. Is it going to cause, do you think, people to be driven out of the market and there to be a reversal of the supply-demand argument? There will be too little supply that house prices will drop significantly because people are moving out of the market because of the price of owning a house.
Well, I think when you've got a supply-constrained market, you see big swings in either direction because the market simply can't respond as much. And that's, I think, what we're seeing now. We are in a correction now of previous excesses in house price inflation. Whether that will actually improve affordability is a different matter, because you may have the same house that is worth quite a bit less now than it was maybe a year ago, and yet at the same time our interest rates are going up and are basically compensating for the money you would have had to spend. And so affordability may not change that much if we see a significant increase in interest rates now, because even on a house with a corrected value, people would now have to pay much more for their mortgage.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Oliver, thank you for talking to me this morning. I appreciate that. I would like to talk to you more about lots of other things. You're an interesting think tank at the end of the day, aren't you?
I hope so.
It must be to be honest with you, I'm sort of surprised by you, Oliver. A think tank thinks, and it spends an awful amount of time, energy and effort trying to convince politicians to get there. Have you ever thought, just why don't you go straight into the political process, get elected, and then make the changes yourself?
Yes, of course, the thought strikes you now and then. However, I think in the long run, I can be a lot more influential running a think tank.
All right. Okay. Well, that's your assessment. Fair enough. Good on you.